Right now, somewhere in your house or in the house next door, there's probably a dog or a cat curled up on a couch. Not a fox, not a raccoon, not a deer, a squirrel, or a wild boar. Even though every single one of those animals lives closer to humans than you might think, and none of them are locked in cages. They just don't live with us. Only two species really made it all the way inside the house, sleeping in the bed, eating from a bowl, treated less like an animal and more like family. That should strike you as strange. Out of the millions of species sharing this planet with us, why did it come down to exactly these two? The answer isn't really about cuteness. It's about a very specific, very narrow evolutionary doorway. And almost no other animal on Earth happened to walk through it the same way dogs and cats did. Let's start with the dog because the story is older, weirder, and far less deliberate than most people assume. For a long time, the popular version of dog domestication went something like this. A caveman found a wolf pup, raised it by hand, and slowly bred a friendlier version of it over generations. It's a nice story. It's also, according to most modern researchers, probably wrong. Evolutionary biologist Raymond Coppinger spent decades studying dog behavior and proposed a very different theory, one centered on garbage rather than affection. As early human settlements started producing consistent waste, from butchered animal remains to discarded food scraps, wolves that were slightly less afraid of humans could approach these garbage piles and eat safely, while their more fearful, more aggressive pack members kept their distance. Coppinger argued that natural selection, not human intention, did the heavy lifting here. The wolves that tolerated proximity to humans survived better and reproduced more, generation after generation, slowly nudging an entire population toward tameness without anyone deliberately breeding for it. Think about what this actually required biologically. Fear response in wild animals isn't just a behavior, it's tied to hormone levels, particularly stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which are themselves under genetic influence. A wolf with a naturally lower baseline fear response toward humans wasn't making a conscious choice to be brave. It was simply born with a slightly different physiology, one that happened to be perfectly suited for a brand new ecological niche that had just opened up, the human garbage pile. Over enough generations, that small physiological advantage compounded, the same way any beneficial trait does under natural selection, and a distinct, human-tolerant wolf population gradually emerged. In other words, dogs may not have been tamed by humans at all, at least not at first. They may have essentially domesticated themselves, drawn in by the easiest, most reliable food source on the planet, us. Once that early self-selection process began, though, humans absolutely took the wheel. Oxford paleogeneticist Gregor Larson has spent years analyzing ancient dog DNA to trace exactly when and where this relationship solidified, and his research suggests dog domestication happened at least 15,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, making dogs by far the oldest domesticated animal on the planet. Older than farming itself, older than pottery, older than permanent settlements. Larson's genetic work indicates the process wasn't a single clean event either. It likely happened gradually, in multiple regions, as different wolf populations independently drifted toward tolerating, then cooperating with, early human groups. This matters because it means dogs weren't invented once, in one place, by one clever ancestor. They emerged, more than once, wherever wolves and humans happened to share overlapping territory and a similar diet of large game. And once dogs were in, humans discovered something remarkable. This animal was useful in an enormous number of different ways. Dogs could guard a camp at night, alerting humans to predators or intruders long before human senses would catch anything, thanks to hearing and smell far more sensitive than our own. Dogs could hunt alongside humans, tracking prey with a nose vastly more sensitive than anything in the human sensory toolkit, effectively turning every hunting party into a team with a built-in tracking device. Dogs could herd other domesticated animals, effectively multiplying a shepherd's ability to manage livestock single-handedly, covering ground and controlling a flock in ways no human alone ever could. Dogs could even provide warmth on cold nights, something indigenous Australian communities have historically referenced in the phrase three-dog night, describing exactly how many dogs you'd need curled around you to survive a particularly freezing evening. No other animal offered that combination of traits: intelligence, loyalty, trainability, and genuine practical utility across guarding, hunting, herding, and companionship, all wrapped into one species willing to bond emotionally with an entirely different species. Wolves are smart. Foxes are smart. But neither naturally forms the kind of flexible, cooperative social bond with humans that dogs do almost automatically once raised around us. That specific combination, high intelligence paired with an unusual willingness to treat a human as a social partner rather than a rival or a threat, turned out to be exceptionally rare in the animal kingdom. And it's a large part of why dogs spread to every inhabited continent alongside humans, adapting into thousands of distinct breeds along the way. Cats tell an almost completely opposite story, and it's arguably even stranger. Cats were never bred for a job the way dogs were, at least not directly. Nobody selectively bred cats to guard, hunt cooperatively, or herd anything. Instead, cats basically hired themselves. Geneticist Carlos Driscoll led a major study, published in the journal Science, tracing the genetic origins of the domestic cat back to a population of wildcats in the Fertile Crescent, the same broad region where humans first began farming grain around 10,000 years ago. Driscoll's research points to a simple, almost accidental chain of events. Once humans started storing surplus grain, that stored grain inevitably attracted rodents. Rodents, in turn, attracted wild cats, who found an incredible, endlessly replenishing food source sitting right next to human settlements. This is a fundamentally different kind of domestication story than the one that produced dogs. Dogs were pulled toward humans by proximity and reward, and gradually reshaped by both natural selection and deliberate human breeding into an animal built for cooperation. Cats, by comparison, were pulled toward a resource, the rodents, that happened to exist because of humans, without ever really needing to change their relationship to humans themselves. The grain store was the actual attraction. Humans were, at least initially, almost incidental to the arrangement. Unlike dogs, cats didn't need to become obedient or cooperative to be useful. They just needed to keep showing up and killing rodents, which cats were already extremely good at doing entirely on instinct, no training required. Humans noticed the pest control benefit almost immediately and started tolerating, then actively encouraging, cats to stick around. The relationship worked because cats never really needed us to change their core behavior at all. They just needed us to keep having a rodent problem, which, as any farming society quickly learns, we always do. This explains something people often find genuinely strange about cats compared to dogs. Cats are, genetically and behaviorally, remarkably close to their wild ancestors. Driscoll's genetic comparisons found that domestic cats and their nearest wild relative, the African wildcat, are still similar enough to interbreed today. Dogs, by contrast, have been reshaped so dramatically over thousands of years of selective breeding that a Chihuahua and a wolf barely resemble each other physically or behaviorally anymore. Cats simply never needed that kind of deep transformation because their usefulness never depended on obedience. It depended entirely on them just being cats. So why didn't this happen with other animals? Why isn't there a thriving pet fox industry or millions of pet raccoons curled up on couches worldwide? Part of the answer traces back to a famous decades-long experiment conducted in the Soviet Union by geneticist Dmitry Belyaev starting in the 1950s. Belyaev selectively bred silver foxes purely based on one trait: tameness toward humans, nothing else. Each generation, only the calmest, least fearful foxes were allowed to breed forward, with researchers testing each fox's reaction to human presence and handling before making the selection. Within just a few generations, something remarkable started happening. The tame foxes didn't just become friendlier, they physically started changing too, developing floppy ears, curled tails, and patchy fur coloring, traits strikingly similar to what you'd see in a domestic dog, despite nobody selecting for any of those physical traits directly. Belyaev's experiment revealed that selecting for tameness alone seems to trigger a whole cascade of other physical and behavioral changes, a phenomenon researchers now call domestication syndrome, likely because the genes controlling stress hormones and fear response are biologically linked to genes controlling pigmentation and cartilage development elsewhere in the body. But here's the catch, and it's the entire reason foxes never became house pets the way dogs and cats did. Belyaev's experiment took decades of extremely deliberate, controlled breeding by professional geneticists, tracking thousands of individual foxes across dozens of generations to produce a genuinely tame fox population. Dogs and cats, by comparison, essentially fast-track this process through sheer proximity and mutual benefit over thousands of years of casual, ongoing contact with humans, no laboratory required. Most wild animals never get that kind of sustained opportunity. They either avoid humans entirely, get hunted, or simply don't offer humans anything useful enough to justify centuries of tolerance and continued closeness. That's really the core filter at work here. To become a globally dominant human pet, an animal needed to check several boxes simultaneously. It had to tolerate proximity to humans without becoming dangerously aggressive. It had to offer some clear practical benefit, whether guarding, hunting, or pest control. And it had to be capable of reproducing successfully in human-adjacent environments across many generations. Dogs checked every one of those boxes through cooperative usefulness. Cats checked them through independent usefulness. Almost nothing else on the planet managed to check all three at once, at the same time, in the same place, for long enough for the relationship to stick permanently. Right now, somewhere in your house or in the house next door, there's probably a dog or a cat curled up on a couch. Not because they're inherently more lovable than every other animal on Earth, but because thousands of years ago, through completely different paths, one waiting patiently by our fires and the other stalking quietly through our grain stores, they were simply the two species that found a way in and never really left. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.